Good morning. This is Tom Remington, and welcome to an episode of Open Air with Tom Remington. I'm really kind of angry and frustrated and disappointed, and everything kind of wrapped up in one. And it all really began the other day, and it's kind of snowballed from there. And this is all about a discussion that concerns a disease in particular that is known. It's nothing new, but it's known to be carried by the gray wolf, which has the populations of which have grown remarkably in the northern Rocky Mountains region in the last 10 years, let's say. And it has reached a point where it's become a concern. However, what's puzzling me and angering me all at the same time is what appears to be this need for people to disregard facts, disregard science that exists, that's out there. And this is coming from government officials, people who are responsible for the public safety and health of the citizens. It's their job. And part of the problem that exists is there's not enough available science. There hasn't been a good job of educating. However, that doesn't excuse or give people an excuse to disregard facts simply because, well, it's not included in their sources. There should be no problem with discovering truth, and especially when it comes to personal health and the public safety. It's one thing in these wolf debates to talk about whether it was the same subspecies and how many is enough and how many are there and what's going on with the elk and deer, moose population, that sort of thing. But this is different stuff. But anyway, this started the other day when a person who heads up or has been involved or is the wolf coordinator for the state of Idaho and has been involved in this since day one, has a Facebook page. And on that Facebook page, he posted up a comment that really disturbed me to no end, considering his position. Now, if he was just some whatever, that would have been different. But this guy is a government official responsible for public health and safety and that sort of thing. But he says there are a number of politicians out there trying to convince people who believe everything they hear that the wolf tapeworm is going to kill you. It's hard to believe the media hasn't jumped on this bullshit. So I'm chiming in to tell you that's all it is, bullshit. Check with the CDC and your state wildlife veterinarian. Okay, well, first of all, he's blaming politicians. We all like to blame politicians, but politicians don't know anything about science. And I understand that's his point. However, he should be addressing scientists who actually know something about the disease before he goes off half-cocked and puts out stuff that is readily available that anyone can find, which disputes what he says. So, to follow his advice, he says check with the CDC. So, I checked with the CDC. I've done this several times. There's nothing new on there. The CDC basically puts out the same information that they have. They put out the life cycle of this Echinococcus granulosus egg parasite, and the primary host and the intermediate host, and how the cycle has to keep going. And I won't get into that specifically, but I'll give you some information later on where you can go and read more and more about it. But to stay on task here, we're talking about a parasite that It's known. There's no disputing the fact that wolves in Idaho and Montana, anyway, are infected with this EG egg, or Echinococcus granulosus egg, and I'll call it EG, okay? And that in their feces, these eggs come out, and then from that point, the eggs can be ingested by elk and deer and moose and sheep and cattle and human beings. And no, you don't have to eat the scat to get the eggs, and we'll get into that a little bit too. But the problem is, the animals, the same as human beings, if you ingest these eggs into your system, you can develop cysts. These are called hydatid cysts. The disease is called hidatidosis. And it could be deadly. It's a serious thing to consider, and we shouldn't be calling bullshit. I mean, it's just so irresponsible to do that when there are, well, 5, 6 known cases of human hidatidosis in the state of Idaho alone. Now, I happen to know of 2, and I've written about them on my blog, and you can go there and research that information. The one in particular was mostly done by George Dovell, editor of The Outdoorsman, who put all the information together. Outstanding work he did to do that. So we know the disease exists in humans there, and still we're calling it bullshit? Okay, so check with the CDC. I did. It doesn't tell me anything. It doesn't tell me what I need to know. Okay? It will tell me in there that if I get the disease, I can grow cysts, and, you know, it could be fatal if you read far enough. Okay? The problem is it doesn't tell you how can you get the disease. Okay? So the information at CDC is outdated, incomplete, and, well, it's almost irrelevant, but I don't want to say irrelevant because it does contain some useful information. Okay, so this person's next advice was to check with the state wildlife veterinarian, and in case of Idaho, his name is Dr. Mark Drew. Well, as it turns out, as part of this sequence of events that took place, that got me all riled up, is a day or 2 after this Facebook posting was put up, an article come out in the newspaper of information that was put out by Mark Drew about these EG eggs and the threat and danger to humans. Now, as I read along here, I'm going to read excerpts from the article, and when it comes to a direct quote from Dr. Mark Drew, I will tell you it's a direct quote. Otherwise, the information I'm reading is information that was written by the reporter who did the article, okay? The article reads, the feces of wolves infested with adult tapeworms contain tiny Echinococcus granulosus eggs. Deer and elk that graze near fresh wolf feces can ingest the eggs. The ingested eggs hatch, and the larvae migrate to the abdomen or lungs of deer and elk, where they form fluid-filled sacs known as hydatid cysts that can grow as large as baseballs and contain hundreds to thousands of immature tapeworms. True. Okay. Further down, the same article says, people who handle fresh wolf feces can be exposed to the parasite and develop hydatid cysts. Drew said precautions such as wearing rubber gloves when field dressing wolves, avoiding contact with their feces, and thorough hand washing will prevent infection. Direct quote from Dr. Mark Drew, simple hygiene and personal protection will make the possibility of exposure to that parasite extremely low. It can't I can't say it's never going to happen, but the risk of exposure for the average person, the wolf hunter, that sort of thing is low, and it's made even lower by wearing personal protective gear. End of direct quote. The article reads, many people believe ungulates and humans, ungulates are deer, elk, moose, sheep, whatever, and humans can become infected by breathing airborne spores near dried wolf feces. Drew said Echinococcus granulosus does not produce spores, and the only danger comes from fresh feces that is still moist. Direct quote, the eggs do not survive desiccation. Once they dry out, they are not viable. End of direct quote. This is from the veterinary, Mark Drew, in the state of Idaho. So is his information correct? Okay, well, I sent this information to several scientists and researchers that I know that have studied and are very familiar with, e.g., hydatid disease, diseases that wolves carry, and I got their responses back to this statement by the veterinarian. So I'd like to share those with you. First of all, from Dr. Delane Kritsky, the Department of Health and Nutrition Sciences at Idaho State University, who specializes in parasitology, wrote me and said, Tom, I don't know Mark Drew, but he's wrong. While desiccation may eventually kill the onconosphere, that's the larvae within the egg, eggs have a thick shell and can remain viable for a considerable length of time after drying. Okay, that's from Dr. Kritsky. Okay, so a considerable length of time. We'll find out a little bit more about how considerable that length of time is. Okay, I got a response back from Will Graves. Will Graves, researcher, he's been studying wolves and the diseases. He's familiar with diseases. He worked for the Department of Agriculture, finding and treating animal diseases across the globe. He studied about the wolves in Russia extensively and wrote a book on it. Incidentally, Will Graves sent a letter to the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service leading up to the introduction of wolves, and in there he expressed his concern about these diseases, and he and some of the people that I'm referencing here today and others warned them of exactly what is going on today with the diseases that are showing up on the landscape there, threatening these people. And yet Will Graves' letter was totally, basically just disregarded in the whole scheme of things. Mr. Graves was requesting that discussion and research and more information be sought about this, and it was never done. So Will writes me back and says, Tom, the eggs can survive and infect for several years in cold and freezing weather. Domestic dogs can pick up the eggs by rolling in wolf scat, and then the dogs can bring the eggs into houses where they are a threat to children and adults. I think they can infect for several months in water. Okay. Then I got a response back from Dr. Clay Dethlefsen. And I'm going to call him Dr. Clay because it's easier than doing the last name repeatedly. Okay. Dr. Clay's response was longer, precise, and very involved. And I am going to take the time to read it because it's extremely important to this whole atrocity that's taking place. He says, Dr. Clay says, Tom, the eggs can survive and infect for several years. Whoops, I'm sorry, I'm reading what Will Graves wrote. Okay, Dr. Clay says, this statement by Drew, that's Dr. Drew, the veterinary, the state veterinary for the state of Idaho, is misleading. By the way, Dr. Clay is a doctor of veterinary medicine. He's several degrees, and he's also a member, to be forthcoming, a member of the Western Predator Control group in the Northwest region. Okay, Dr. Clay says this statement by Dr. Drew is misleading. He is right about spores not being a mechanism for distribution. Now, before you run off half-cocked saying, "There, I told you people can't get it from spores," listen to what he says and take the entire thing in context, please. Okay? Because the eggs that survive the drying out of feces are not spores and never were. Okay, so he's saying that Drew is right, that you can't, contract the disease from spores because, as he says here, feces cannot or do not create spores. Now, before I continue, maybe I can clarify or help people understand here a little bit of where this might have come from. Perhaps it was Dr. Valgeis. I don't remember it. I'm not trying to blame anybody. I'm just trying to recall where I read this. I remember somebody describing those the dried feces and the eggs that existed in that feces. Nobody that I'm aware of that I seek for scientific information on this have ever called them spores. Okay? They were once described in something I read, and I'm not exactly sure, so I won't say, that the dried eggs, the dried feces, that the dried eggs were spore-like, okay? And perhaps that was a poor choice to do, but there's a far cry from spore-like and spores. Now, I'm sure that over time that's kind of, people have taken that and instead of describing these eggs as spore-like, well, it's just, they're spores, So we get this vision that, puffs of clouds running around in the wilderness with these eggs in them, and we're all going to get sick and die. That's not the case. However, Dr. Clay goes on further to explain this process and how it actually works. So the feces don't create spores, but they do have eggs in them, and these eggs do last a long time, even after the wolf scat has dried out. Dr. Clay says he is completely wrong about moist versus dry feces, wolf scat. Drew is playing a game of semantics with obviously limited current research knowledge, and as such is misleading the public. And then he goes on to explain that the temperatures at which the eggs can exist, to minus 60 to minus 80 degrees Celsius, and as high a temperatures as 170 degrees Fahrenheit. But he goes on and says, as I mentioned today, there is a study that tested the longevity of Echinococcus granulosus eggs and their viability in a severely desiccating environment. The study results showed that EG eggs can and do survive these environmental conditions for long periods of time and are still infectious. In fact, after 41 months in this study's severe desiccating environment, the eggs were still infectious to sheep. And if they are infectious to sheep, there's a significant probability that they are infectious to man, especially when one notes that the sheep strain is considered very infectious to man. As to the question of airborne infection, we're back to this spore thing, this really needs some qualifying parameters, and you should listen and pay attention because it is important. This could be the difference of whether or not you can become infected. It is very unlikely that eggs made airborne from dried out scat will elevate into a cloud of dust, so that people are not much at risk from such a massive cloud. So in other words, you know, if let's say somebody goes walking by and steps in some dried wolf scat, there ain't this big vapor cloud behind them that's full of spores that become airborne and blow away someplace where, you know, somebody having a picnic a half a mile down the road will inhale the spores. Okay, but he does explain further. But they can be infected by leaning over to inspect the scat, which brings them into close proximity to the feces, and if the feces is severely dry to the extent of creating a small dust cloud with eggs in it, this cloud would probably be more a topsoil cloud than an actual feces cloud. In other words, you know, if you bend down and you poking around and digging at dried wolf scat, there's the possibility that, you know, a puff of clouds may contain eggs that you can contract. Be aware of the fact, if you decide to touch it with your hand or with your glove or kick it with your boot, there's a pretty good chance those eggs can remain there on your boot, on your glove, or on your hand. Tastes good, huh? Okay. With this condition, it is feasible that a small cloud would be created with eggs in it. Thus, the eggs can become airborne, and the dust with the eggs inhaled. The question then becomes, where do these eggs go, and will they cause hydatid cysts, which presupposes that the eggs are viable? Okay, I want to point out something here before I continue. There's that whole thing about the dust cloud and inhaling the eggs and that sort of stuff is nothing new from what I have been told since this discussion was known to me several years ago. Dr. Geist has told me this information. I've read it from him. I've read it from Will Graves and from others. So there's nothing that's changed here. Okay, it just sounds like, you know, the choice of words may, you know, have gotten kind of misconstrued here over time. Dr. Clay continues, after entering the mouth, okay, the clouds, if you inhale or ingest these eggs from a cloud or in some other fashion, after entering the mouth or nasal cavity, they are inhaled into the are they inhaled into the respiratory system, or are they subsequently swallowed and enter the digestive system, which is the way humans generally become infected. Assuming they enter the digestive system and are viable, humans can get hydatid disease. It is true that once eggs dry out sufficiently as to be nothing more than pebble-like, they are not infectious. However, just because the scat dries out or the eggs are exposed to a desiccating environment does not mean they are not infectious. This is totally contrary to what Dr. Drew has put out. He's the state veterinary that's responsible for passing information to the citizens of Idaho about the dangers that exist. Okay? He continues, Dr. Clay continues, also, there's another study that analyzed flies as a vector of transmission eggs. Consider this, okay? Coprophagic flies, feces eaters, were examined, and it was determined that these flies are coming into contact with infected scat, can and do ingest a significant number of viable eggs. The study noted that these infected flies travel up to 1.8 kilometers in 24 hours and then can deposit the eggs where they land. If you are a hunter, for example, and they land on your sandwich lunch, it appears they can deposit viable eggs. which you will unknowingly consume. This, of course, is currently only a supposition, but it warrants alerting the public, if only as a precaution. So there's a study that suggests this, but we're still going to tell people it's bullshit. Don't worry about it. You know, oh, you can't get infected. Wear some rubber gloves and wash your hands. You're okay. Okay. Another vector, in other words, another something that can spread this disease is birds, particularly magpies, eagles, ravens, etc., that feed on carcasses, infected wolves left on the ground after they are killed. Obviously, this presupposes the wolves' intestines contain E.g. tapeworms, which is becoming more and more the case. Currently, Pullman lab reports indicate that up to 83% of the wolf population in north-central Idaho have egg-producing tapeworms, which is up from 62% in 2008. I hope this helps clear up the objective assessment, okay? And it does. It's tremendous, and I appreciate this response. So, I mean, this is over. When you consider the vectors, the possibilities that exist, 60 to 80% of the wolves infected. There's, you know, officially perhaps 1,700 to 2,000, unofficially as many as 4,000 or 5,000 wolves now. I don't like the odds. And the unanswered questions is, are the coyotes also carrying this stuff? Chances are pretty good they are, if the wolves are. Not good. Okay. It's getting a little long here. I don't want this to be long, any longer than it has to, but I want to let you know that I also got a response from Dr. Val Geis. He's a professor emeritus at the University of Calgary, has studied extensively as a wildlife biologist. He studied disease. Matter of fact, he makes reference in here that I was out in the wilds in the 50s and 60s, and we had plenty of wildlife and still had well-behaved wolves. But what he says in here is that, it was he, a professor that he had 50 years ago, that cautioned about wolf scats and the probability that we would inhale and get them in the mouth. 50 years ago, this was being discussed. But no real research has been done, because we didn't have wolves. We didn't have coyotes running everywhere. Coyotes are in Central Park, Golden Gate Park. They're in everybody's backyard. Again, I ask, are coyotes carrying this? We need to find out. We don't need to say bullshit. We don't need to tell people they got to eat scat to get this disease. We need to go find out, you know. Oh my. So anyway, Dr. Val Geis responds to these series of emails, and he says, thank you, Clay. That's Dr. Clay Deathliston. Your account is more detailed than I could produce without some further literature research. It is spot on. Okay, then further down, Dr. Geis says, why drew a and this to me just is what just turned my guts inside out, failing to understand. Okay, why drew a professional in a public position charged with the public welfare would underplay the danger from hydatid disease? I do not understand. The published information on hydatid disease is extensive, and I cannot think of a valid excuse to minimize the threat from hydatid disease. I mean, that says it. You know, you can protect your wolves. It doesn't matter. You can protect your coyotes. It doesn't matter. Say whatever you want to say about whether wolves and coyotes are necessary for the ecosystem, and, oh, I love my wolves and coyotes. We're talking about public health. You can stick your head in the sand. You can deny it all you want to. The truth is there. You're responsible for the people that are going to get sick from this, because you're lying and putting out information that's not true, and it's time that you change. Okay? I can't imagine what anybody would do if they found out their children got sick from this and they were never warned. We have people on the ground in Idaho and Montana that are polling the people who live there and asking them if they're aware of Echinococcus granulosus, the tapeworm, and the hydatid disease and the threat that exists. And the overwhelming majority of them are not. They need to be educated, and the people who can help us do that, the officials, the veterinaries, the media, are not doing their job. They're not helping. They're telling people there's not a problem. Has to stop. Hey, that's my rant. Join me again on Open Air with Tom Remington. We'll see you next time.